This is your Truth Bombs weekly wrap. Right now, we're going to look back at the past week and look at the key themes that impacted your portfolio and by extension, your financial comfort. And it was quite a week indeed. It was an abbreviated week because we had Thanksgiving on Thursday. Markets were closed on Thursday. And on Friday, we had a partial day on Friday, but a lot of stuff happened before we all took the Turkey Day break. So let's start with the key themes. Theme number one, I call that this past week the Thanksgiving melt up week. And in stocks, melting up is kind of a good thing, right? If you remember last week was a melt down week leading into last Friday. If you recall, there was a lot of negative investment sentiment out there. People are very nervous about the economy, nervous about overextended valuations in your favorite stocks. There were rotations going on. We were worried about the Fed, and the Fed was talking like hawks, and the hawks were circling, and everyone was nervous, and stocks were trading off. They just could not get a foothold in the prior week. And on Friday, a lot of that turned around. That is the prior Friday, when the New York City Fed president, John Williams, came out and said something kind of dovish. Now, John Williams, not an ordinary Fed president. He is the Fed vice president because the New York Fed gets special treatment. Just saying, New York, right? So he gets special treatment, and he is not only the vice president, but he's a permanent voting member. So he's got a lot of sway. Not as much as Powell, but he's got sway. And he came out, and he is known as a slight dove, not a very dovish guy. And he made some dovish comments. And that was really enough to turn the markets around. The prior Friday, I know I'm recapping a little bit. We went into the prior Friday expecting the fact that we are not going to possibly get any rate cuts in December. And because of his comments, those shot up. And by Monday of this past week, the probabilities were in the 70s and 80s% in terms of probabilities. And that was a big theme that helped markets push forward. So markets rallied on the prior Friday. That rally carried forward straight up until Thanksgiving and until the Thanksgiving holiday. And it's very interesting. It was like an everything rally. So first and foremost, as you might guess, people went after the cheap growth stocks, but it wasn't just growth stocks. So I would say it is a everything melt up rally. That's pretty good. And this time of year, we typically talk about a potential Santa rally. You heard it here first. But starting in the upcoming week, you're going to hear people start talking about, can there be a Santa rally, right? Stocks tend to do well this time of year because people are feeling good. And then historically, that just has happened. A convenient observation from a statistical standpoint. But we talk about a Santa rally every year. And people have not talked about it yet because stocks have been under so much pressure up until this prior week. And so maybe we'll start talking about a Santa rally. Who knows? We'll see. People are certainly happy. We're happy going into Thanksgiving. Okay. Theme number two. This is an interesting one. I don't like to talk about Tesla too often. And when I do, it's usually that I'm joking about it. But Tesla did something very interesting the past week. Tesla tried to rebrand itself as an AI chip company. Interesting, right? So they came out of the gate talking about their new AI chip. I forget what it's called. Maybe it's called AI 5 or AI 4. Well, it's the next generation one. And they got a little bit of a bump from it, but it's very interesting that Tesla is now trying to sort of change their narrative to join the AI bandwagon. And this is something that we're going to have to watch carefully. This is why I decided to check it off inside the theme area, right? Because if this starts to happen too often, you start to get a little nervous. This sort of gives me this memory of going back to the .com bubble era where people were adding .com to the end of their names, right? Like even Amazon, great company, put .com at the end of their name. Pets, not a good company, put .com at the end of their name. And Salesforce, another good company, also put .com at the end of their name. But that is sort of a sign that things are getting a little bit too bubbly. Well, Tesla came out this week and they really are trying to behave like they're a chip company and maybe make us forget that they still sell cars and they still have to buy aluminum and they still have to buy batteries and steel and rubber and plastic. But they also do make chips. So I will give them that. Like I said, I talk a lot about, I do a lot of tongue in cheek on Tesla. Musk is a brilliant industrialist. Again, we poke a lot of fun, but I certainly would not bet against that guy. And he's got some good stuff there. They had that AI 6 chip. I just saw it in my notes here. They just came out with that. Now let's remember where that is. It's not competing with NVIDIA or anything else. That's another theme we'll talk about after. But that is very specific to, let's say, automobiles and robots and robo-taxis. So that has implications there. That was an interesting theme of the week. Maybe in another week, they wouldn't get away with it. But in this past week where everyone was feeling good, it sort of helped Tesla a little bit. Another big theme, and you're going to hear me talk about it when I go through the weekly economic numbers. Sentiment is a very big thing, right? So we had consumer sentiment numbers come out at the end of the prior week, which we talked a lot about. The Michigan numbers in the past week, we got some more consumer sentiment numbers. And those are very, those are challenging, very challenging. But again, there's this knowledge now that we have this split between Main Street and Wall Street, where stocks are rallying in the everything melt-up rally on the one side, and on the other side, we have sentiment, which is literally crumbling under our feet. And that's the K-shaped economy. You're going to hear us talk a lot more about that. That was a big discussion amongst my colleagues and myself in this past week. What else happened? This another big driver of the week. Again, discussions around the Fed, right? The Fed. Everyone's focused on the Fed. It's an obsession. The market is addicted to rate cuts, for better or worse. And that has absolutely been a big driver of the melt-up rally, the expectations, the turnaround in expectations for a rate cut in December, just a couple weeks away. And that was a big driver. But let's also talk about the Fed and their decision process. They're going to sit down in 2 weeks. They're going to make a decision on how to steer the biggest economy in the world. And they're going to be making that decision without any data, right? So they're driving cross country at 1,000 miles an hour without a map. And why am I saying this? We know about this, right? So all of the data we've been getting, if we've been getting any data, that data has been old data, right? This is like data that should have come out a month ago and 2 months ago. And we're just starting to get that data now. So the Fed's looking at stale data, just like I'm looking at stale data here for the most part, certainly the government data. And the numbers that should have come out for October, so we're looking at September numbers now. The numbers that should have come out for October, because remember, we're in November now, are not going to be delivered. And I talked about this last week, but still this whole week, we got no October data. People were acting and looking at September data. Earlier in the week, I was on CNBC and the host, Frank Holland, asked me about how happy I was that we're going to get all this government data. And I looked over at him and I said, I'm happy, but the data is kind of old. And he kind of looked back at me like, what are you talking about? I'm like, well, I don't care what's happening, what happened in September. Of course I care, but we're in November. So I would like to know what's happening in November, or at least in October. But September, it's kind of old news at this stage. So, I kind of had to sort of push back on him, but there were some good numbers, that important numbers, which we'll cover later on, that we did get in the past week. But the Fed is still basically driving in a fog, essentially. And we're not going to get any October numbers, okay? So there's going to be a big hole for October. So they're never going to even release them. They're not going to release them late. They're just simply not going to release them. So Fed's not going to get any numbers. And they're meeting in 2 weeks. And so they're going to be looking at September numbers to make decisions in December. Kind of crazy, right? I'll give it again. Congratulations in Washington, D.C. We saw continued rotation last week. That's another sort of minor theme. I wouldn't say it was pronounced, right? We saw earlier in the month, we saw rotation sort of out of growth stocks into more, value style, more sort of, industrial type, smokestack industries, lower valuation, stable stocks. We saw, slight reversal of that, right? So obviously we saw a movement back into growth shares once people believe the Fed are going to be a little bit more dovish. And so that theme continued a little bit, but the breadth of the market, even though it's still being led by AI in the past week, you saw a little bit more breadth, which is a very, I think a positive, a very, very positive thing. Because again, to have a long sustainable rally, you want to have everyone participate. You don't want to just have 5 or 6 players like we had earlier in the year. So this could be a pretty good setup for a potential Santa Claus rally. So we had some important themes that we covered this week, right? Let's remember, go over them again. The melt up, the AI companies sort of rebounding. We talked about Tesla trying to rebrand itself as an AI company. There was another theme this week, which I didn't mention before, but it just popped in my mind. But we're going to talk about it a little bit more afterwards. So, but we had some very interesting movement this week with 2 superstars, AI superstars, Google or Alphabet. I'm just going to call it Google. So when I say Google, I mean Alphabet, and NVIDIA, right? And of course, Meta. So all 3 of them are in some sort of interesting triangle, which I'm going to talk about later. But a lot of very interesting themes came out of that, such as mainly, is there competition out there for NVIDIA? The untouchable NVIDIA, can there be competition? The answer is yes. Is it bad? The answer is no. And we'll talk more about that eventually. But that was a big theme this week, and there was a lot of talk around that. And again, we talked about the K-shaped economy that continued. And of course, finally, the Fed. And those were the key themes that impacted your portfolios and your financial comfort in the week that just passed. I just want to remind you at this point, check out our homepage. We have so many videos that we put out that go into far more depth than what I could possibly go into in this weekly wrap. A lot of the things that we discussed are there, and we go into a lot of depth there. So we have our daily videos, we have our bomb blasts that we put out, which talk about things that are happening during the day, important things that you need to know. You need to be kept in the loop because that's how you win at this game. So if you like this type of content, start by clicking like and subscribe. And that's how you will be kept in the loop. Because at Wall Street Truth Bombs, we drop them here before the market figures them out.